Good morning, everyone. As I stated earlier, my name is Jolivette and Anderson-Douoning, and I do race, place, and space. But I primarily am looking at cultural education, and the title of my presentation today is In Golina's Hand, 3 Generations of Black Cultural Education in a Segregated Hollywood Neighborhood of Shreveport, Louisiana. And of course, for today here at ASALH. Before I do anything, I have to do what I call this academic invocation, if you will bear with me. This is actually a quote. Atunda, he was the primal enslaved, with the will to fashion his own freedom, and in so doing to establish that none but the enslaved can free him or herself. Eshu, a natural force who controls both the benevolent and the malevolent supernatural powers, he is the guardian of Orumila's oracular utterances. Without Eshu to open the portals to the past and the future, Orumila, the divination deity, would be blind. As a neutral force, he straddles all realms and acts as an essential factor in any attempt to resolve the conflicts between contrasting and coterminous forces in the world. With that, I have 3 areas that I will look at as time permits. African American identity as an extension of African identity via shared wisdom, semiotics, and symbology. Life purpose and preparation, looking at the African village concept and the concept that was present in segregated Black neighborhoods. I'm basically in search of a hidden curriculum. How did parenting, Black parenting in Black neighborhoods influence me? How does it influence children? And what did the parents who were living in segregated communities in these areas that my colleague talked about that were low tax bracket areas that said how much tax dollars could actually be fed into the neighborhood public school, which was an all-Black public school that I attended from kindergarten through 6th grade. How did they make up for what was missing inside of the schooling system? And I argue that today probably more is missing now than it was then because of the involvement of Black parents and what was happening in the neighborhood that was an extension of what actually went on inside of the schools. And parenting overall, talking about genealogy, and I'll define what I mean by genealogy, generational experiences, and also travel as an extension of traditional schooling in the Hollywood neighborhood itself. A lot of what I do has been passed down generationally from my mother and my grandmother. So when we talk about genealogy and generational experiences, I will bring them in, and thus the name of my presentation, In Golina's Hands, because my grandmother's name was Golina. Just a couple of some background on shared wisdom, semiotics, and symbology. First and foremost, my research involves curriculum and instruction. I'm in American studies, not African American studies. And I do, in American studies at Purdue, we are required to have a focus area, and mine is curriculum and instruction, because when I was working in Mississippi under the guidance of Dr. Bob Moses, being around his genius and his brilliance pushed me to ask questions that he was asking of me. Like, we have this thing that we're doing with math, but he one day said to the young people, I want you all to listen to what Jolivette has to say, because you need to get in touch with who you are culturally. So that pushed me to address some of the issues that he was addressing with his concept of sharecropper education and this inheritance of what young people inherited from the civil rights workers that we don't know their names that were in Mississippi that he was working with, going door to door, and now he was working with their grandchildren, okay? And so he would run into a couple of the people he worked with, grandkids, while he was working in Lanier High School in Mississippi. So what I did was I developed a curriculum called D-Ciphers. The D in D-Ciphers stands for Jale or Jale. And the Jolivette are historians, they're griots, they're the people that keep the wisdom of the village. And so to decipher means we must go back and figure out the history of who we are. We must find out what makes us who we are as human beings, and human beings in this skin, right? This dark skin, and it has to be before what happened in this country with slavery. It has to be a world history that embodies to go from local to global and global to local. So when I talk about shared wisdom, I look at Atualo Omaha's quote on what ethno-philosophy is, and it is a term coined by Pauline Hotunji. It referred to a philosophy that is basically the shared wisdom, and the emphasis on that is mine, of a people. He held that African philosophy was still a future, or at least a recent project, and would develop in tandem with and based on scientific advancement. So when we talk about African philosophy, how we think and what we know about ourselves as African peoples, we also have to ask those questions about how the trajectory of what it means to be an African person has evolved for us in the United States. So when we say we are an African people, we've gone through a particular trajectory from African to captive on those ships that my brother was speaking about earlier before we started. And we move from captive to the enslaved. I say enslaved instead of slave. And free persons of color and what those things mean. And we move from there to this definition of what it means to be colored, then this definition of what it means to be Negro, and then from Negro to Afro-American, from Afro-American to Black, and then from Black to now African-American. And you can subscribe a time frame to those names, those identifiers, even though they overlap, they interchange, they cross generations. My grandmother died when I was about 18, so she would, as I used to say to the young people when I talked to them, she'd bust a colored on you in a minute, right? Say somebody's colored. My mother, who was born in 1940, would often say Negro. And then I came along, and I was born in 68, and I would identify as Black. If you ask my daughter, who's sitting here, she'll tell you she's African American. And so all of those are part of identifiers that we use to describe and define who we are, how we see ourselves, and how other people see us in the world. And that, in large part, has a lot to do with how the young person was talking in the piece that you were talking about. And let me move quickly because I only have a limited amount of time and I have a whole lot of stuff I want to say. But the semiotics piece is the definition based on semiosis, the relationship between a sign, an object, and a meaning, right? So what we see and how we ascribe meaning to what we see, can we put that in a cultural context? When you see Black people, or when you think about Black people, when you see a Black person, what is the meaning that you ascribe to that person's humanity? What is the meaning you ascribe to that person as they identify themselves if you have a conversation with them? If they identify themselves as Black versus African American. So these are things that we look at on how we see ourselves internally, which is what my curriculum addresses, and also how we are viewed by other people from the outside. And then cultural semiotics is actually something that exists as well. It's a holistic approach to the problem of meaning generations, all right? Meaning generation as the ability of culture, both as whole and as the sum of its parts, to generate as output non-trivial new text. So I look at the lived experience as text, okay? The lived experience as text. And what I mean by that is that this is something my father put together before he passed away. And it says the family of Washington Anderson, he came to Louisiana sometime between 1820 and 1835. He sat over after church on Sundays. He would sit with my Uncle Claiborne, who was one of the children of my grandfather's first set of kids with Mary Taylor. My father was the third set of children with Addie McCain. So he would sit with Uncle Claiborne on church after Sundays, partly because Uncle Claiborne's eyes were leaving him, and he would help him calculate. He was the treasurer, so we'd help him do the church money. And one day, it was after Roots that my dad came on in the 70s, that my dad got this notion of, Uncle Claiborne remembers Brother Claiborne remembers all those names. I need to go sit down there and talk to him. But it wasn't until the early 80s that he actually went and sat and talked to him, because he figured, he's not going to be around much longer. He's born in 1901. And so he finally did it. He finally talked to him, and he got all these names of Washington's children, how we came to be, all of, and he put all this, and I can pass that around later for you guys to see. If you know any Andersons, North Louisiana, or anywhere, they're probably connected some kind of way via this document. So next thing that I wanted to deal with is symbology. What I use is Carrere method. Thank you, ma'am. I use the Carrere method done by William Pinar, who's one of the top people in curriculum and instruction, I would dare say, in the world. Pinar uses this four-step method or four-step curriculum. The first step is regressive, like we have to go back to something. And he's all about the individual, the human's biography. And so when I looked at his four-step method, I was like, there's something going on here. And so I laid down his method, and then I laid down my curriculum of my 9 ciphers beside it. These ciphers has 9 circles that students have to define what's inside of the circles. The first 2 circles stay the same. It's an equation, x plus y to the 5th equals self. And you have to go through these questions you develop, asking questions of yourself about yourself, and you answer those questions. So it also becomes kind of a writing activity. The second set is the environment. R to the 6 plus A equals environment. How do I apply what I know or what I've learned about these questions? How do I apply that in my day-to-day life, right? So those 2 stay the same. And then you have 9 other circles which you go through that are sets of 7. So what I did was I laid down these circles or these ciphers alongside Adinkra symbols to match what the Carrere method was talking about. So of course I have the first one, and I'll only be able to deal with the first one. The first one was, of course, the Sankofa. That matches the regressive because you have to go back and fetch it or go back and get those things that actually worked in the past and try to bring them forward into the present and plant seeds for them to also be going into the future if they are working. But we have to look at how culture changed, how geographies change, how time periods change from agrarian to industrial to technological, and map those and match those alongside parenting and how our parents looked at life via the agrarian lens, via the industrial lens, and now via the information and technology lens. And what actually changes about parenting and how we communicate with our children is the authoritarian way that we use to discipline children. Is that going to work the same way in the age of technology? The agrarian method for discipline may not be the same as the technology way for disciplining children. So the way that I discipline my child, even my sisters and brothers who were raised by the same parents in the same house, they say you're spoiling that child, right? And I'm thinking, no, I'm exposing her, and I'm actually taking the time to answer her questions. And a lot of my friends that are grad students, some of them can't be around me and my daughter because they feel like I let her get away with too much stuff. But that is strategic on my part because I'm actually trying to have engage with her as opposed to saying, stop doing everything that you're doing. And some of the things work, some of the things don't work, and some things I'm fearful of as a black woman raising a child. I gotta stop. Hold on. I gotta show you something. My apologies. I've talked a little bit about these ciphers. This is an example of what one of the ciphers would look like, the visual, because we don't have, and I can let you all see that. But and this is how you get step 1.1 through 1.9 is how you get from cipher to cipher. Mapping your way to the different circles, so it gives the impression or the image that all things are connected, right? One thing influences the other. All right, so in short, I really wish I could have shown you this, but this is my grandmother. My grandmother was a domestic. She worked in the chair factory. She moved from Keithville, Louisiana, to Shreveport, Louisiana. Her name is Golina. And she moved to 3rd Street, which was changed into Ledbetter Street in the Hollywood neighborhood. The Hollywood neighborhood was land that was set aside specifically for black people who wanted to own instead of rent. So everybody that bought a lot in the Hollywood neighborhood had to purchase that lot, and they had to build on that lot. My grandmother kept a journal that I found after my mom died. She wrote down why they moved from Louisiana, from the rural area. Their house burned up. And they had to live with this person and that person and that person and that person. They finally moved to the city. When they moved to the city, she and my step-grandfather had to work at the lumber yard and the chair factory to save enough money. She wrote down how much she paid for the lot. She wrote down how much she paid for nails, who she got to, what she said, pipe the house, so that there would be running water in the house. She wrote down she had to buy used wood instead of new wood to build the house because they couldn't afford new wood. She wrote down all these things. She wrote down when they went out, it was a family affair. The children had to go out and help her chop cotton on the weekends when she wasn't working. And they chopped cotton, and she wrote down how much each one of them earned from chopping cotton, and that money was collected, and that's how they built that house at 5913 Ledbetter Street. When my mother graduated from Wiley and my father graduated from Southern and Baton Rouge, they got married. They met through the church and being rural folk. They got married, and then they bought a house just 3 doors down at 5939 Ledbetter Street, which is the house that me and my brothers and sisters grew up in. So when I'm talking about generational experiences, what happened to them during the 40s, because this journal goes from 1944 up to 1959, and there are these events that take place, and there are names of people that were born during this time that we're not related to, and so I'm assuming, I'm trying to figure out if my grandmother was a midwife. Was she the one that knew how to read and write, that she could actually write down what people want to name their children, because many of them had not gone to school. And she was also born in Longstreet, Louisiana. And Longstreet, Louisiana, as I was driving through it on my way back from Texas up here one time, my daughter's sitting in the car, and I was like, that says something about Booker T. Washington. I gotta stop. And she's like, oh no, not another old building on the road again. Mom, we gotta stop again. So I'm stopping, I'm taking pictures, and I found out that the year my grandmother was born, which was 1920, there was, Booker T. Washington schools that he set up all over the place. One was in Longstreet, Louisiana. So now I have to go through another area to look for more records on her life. And what I'm doing is creating these ethnographic stories about how Black people live their day-to-day life, the weekly rituals that they had to go through from work to church and back again, but what they instilled in us in what I call Black cultural traditions. We couldn't iron, one is we couldn't iron our clothes on Sundays. My grandmother was a domestic, so she taught my mother that ironing is work. So you don't iron on Sunday because you're supposed to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. So we had to iron our clothes on Saturday night for school and church, so we couldn't do any work on Sundays. So there's tons of those things that are hidden in there that were coded that I don't teach my child anymore, but they are definitely real as it relates to the culture itself. And I have to stop, but I did want to show y'all the Deciphers piece, but I'm gonna be quiet and defer to my sister here because she got a lot to say too. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.